Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I was 22 when I took the job at the ranch. A wide, empty stretch of land in the heart of Navajo country, where the nights were darker than the devil's heart and the wind carried whispers you didn't want to hear. It wasn't much, just fixing fences, feeding horses, making sure the cattle weren't picked off by coyotes. Seemed like easy work at the time. Then I stayed past sundown. That night, I was out by the tree line, patching up a section of fence something had torn through. The wood was split like it had been pried apart, not chewed or clawed. I told myself it was just some animal, a bear, maybe, a big one, but there weren't no bears out this way. That's when I heard her voice, soft, distant, carried on the wind, my grandmother's voice. "Arlo, come here, child." My blood turned to ice. She'd been dead for 3 years. The voice drifted closer, rasping, familiar but wrong. Like a needle skipping on an old record, slightly off, slightly broken. I stood there, my hands clenched around the pliers. The night pressed in, thick and heavy. I should have run. I wanted to run, but something deep inside me, something instinctual, told me that if I moved, it would know. A shadow shifted between the trees. At first, I thought it was a coyote. Then it stood up. Its legs were too long. Its arms dangled at its sides like they didn't quite fit in their sockets. Patches of matted fur clung to its skin. But its face, oh God, its face. It grinned at me, wide and full of human teeth. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the pliers. My breath hitched as the thing cocked its head, watching me. Then in my mother's voice it whispered, "Arlo, come here, son." I ran. My boots pounded against the dry earth, lungs burning, heart slamming against my ribs. The thing behind me laughed, a horrible, garbled sound like a man choking on his own spit. I didn't dare look back. The ranch house was still 100 yards away when I heard it running. Not on four legs, too. Fast. Too fast. The porch light flicked on. My boss, Jackson, stood in the doorway, shotgun in hand. His eyes went wide when he saw me. "Get down," he shouted. I dove, just as the gun went off. The blast lit up the night for half a second. That was long enough for me to see it. The thing recoiled, screeching, a high, sharp sound that made my stomach flip. Jackson fired again, and this time it bolted. It didn't run like an animal. It skittered, its limbs twisting in ways they shouldn't, disappearing into the trees without a sound. I lay there, panting, dirt in my mouth. Jackson hauled me up, eyes dark and serious. "You all right?" I nodded. I wasn't. He shut the door behind us, locked it tight. Neither of us spoke. In the morning, I saw the claw marks on the door. Deep, precise, scraping against the wood like something had tried to dig its way in. But that wasn't the worst part. On the porch, just outside the door, was a pile of deer bones. Not scattered, not messy, stacked, perfectly. Jackson saw them and went pale. He turned to me, jaw tight. "You ain't safe here no more, son." I left that afternoon, never went back, and I never, ever stayed past sundown again. Story 2. I was a nurse at a small reservation clinic in Arizona. A quiet place. The kind of building that smelled like bleach and old bandages, tucked between miles of dust and red rock. At night, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows like bony fingers trying to claw their way in. We were understaffed, as always, and I was the only one on duty when she came. The old woman. I don't know how she got in. One minute the waiting room was empty, just the hum of the vending machine and the flickering glow of an old TV mounted in the corner. The next, she was sitting in one of the plastic chairs, wrapped in a tattered brown shawl. Her presence was sudden, like she'd materialized out of thin air. I didn't hear the door open. Her skin looked thin and dry, stretched too tight over her bones. Her fingers curled inward, tipped with nails yellowed and cracked, like they belonged to something long dead. But it was her eyes that unsettled me the most. Too wide, like she wasn't sure how to blink. She just sat there, watching me. I cleared my throat. "Ma'am, can I help you?" Her lips barely moved when she spoke. Something's wrong with my skin. Her voice was brittle, like dead leaves scraping against the pavement. I stood, reaching for the clipboard at the desk. "Okay, let's get you checked in. What's your name?" Silence. I looked up. She hadn't moved, but her face seemed different. Her features sharper. Her mouth stretched into something that was almost a grin, but too wide, like her lips had been cut at the corners. I swallowed. "Do you have any ID?" She shook her head, slow and deliberate. That should have been my cue to call security. Nobody shows up at a clinic in the middle of the night with no name, no records, no past. But instead, I did my job. I grabbed a pen, steadied my nerves. "Okay, can you tell me what's wrong?" She stood. Her movements were strange, too fluid, like she wasn't used to moving in a human body. She stepped closer, and that's when I saw it. Her skin shifted under the harsh fluorescent lights, like something was writhing beneath it. I flinched, nearly dropping the clipboard. "Jesus!" Her hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was inhumanly strong. "Don't tell them," she whispered. Her breath smelled like something rotten, something that had been left out in the sun too long. My stomach lurched. "Let go of me." She didn't. Instead, she tilted her head too far until her neck made a soft cracking sound. Then she laughed. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was high-pitched, warbling, like a hyena mimicking a woman's voice, like something pretending to be human, but not quite understanding how. The lights flickered. The air turned thick, heavy with the scent of old meat. That was when my body decided for me. Fight or flight. I ripped my arm free and stumbled backward, heart hammering. I didn't think. I didn't breathe. I just ran. The supply closet, the only place with a lock. I slammed the door, twisted the lock so hard I thought it would snap. Silence. Then scraping, soft at first. Fingernails dragging along the outside of the door. I pressed myself against the shelves, forcing my breathing to slow. The shadows and the narrow crack of light under the door shifted as something moved outside. Then sniffing, loud, wet, hungry, like an animal hunting. My pulse thundered in my ears. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from gasping. The sniffing grew closer. A shadow passed in front of the crack, blocking out the light. Then a single whisper right at the door. Let me in. My stomach dropped. I knew that voice. It was mine. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to go away, praying, begging. The scratching stopped. The sniffing faded. Then an alarm blared. The emergency exit. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Finally, I forced myself to move. I unlocked the door with shaking hands and stepped out. The clinic was empty, except for the smell, a lingering stench of rot and decay. The automatic doors were wide open, the cold night air blowing in. But when I checked the security footage, I felt my blood turn to ice. The doors opened on their own. No one walked out. No one had been there at all. But that wasn't the worst part. In the footage, right before the doors opened, the camera glitched. And for a single, flickering second, there was something standing behind me. Something tall, with a face that wasn't human anymore. Story 3. We weren't supposed to be there that late. Jake and I had been hiking all day in northern Minnesota, way out past the marked trails, just two idiots thinking we were the next big survivalists. We packed light, carried a cheap compass, and figured we'd be fine. But the woods have a way of making fools out of people. The sun was bleeding into the horizon when we realized we were lost. Our phones were useless. No bars, no GPS. Just miles of trees stretching in every direction, their silhouettes black against the fading light. We should head back the way we came, Jake said. I nodded, but deep down, I knew we were screwed. We'd been walking in circles for hours. The trees all looked the same. That's when we heard it, a rustling. Not the wind, not an animal just minding its business. This was different, purposeful, heavy footfalls in the underbrush. Jake turned his head sharply, listening. You hear that? I swallowed. Yeah. A cold wind cut through the trees. It carried a foul, almost rotten smell, like meat left out in the sun too long. Then something moved. A dark shape shifted in the trees ahead, half hidden in the shadows. At first I thought it was an elk, big, broad shoulders. But then it stood up. I don't mean it reared back. I mean it stood. Too long, bony legs straightened beneath it, lifting its gaunt, skeletal frame to a terrifying height. It was easily 8 feet tall, its ribs pressing against gray, stretched skin, like an animal that had starved to death but was somehow still walking. Its head was wrong, a deer's skull, stripped of flesh, but its eyes were alive. Not dead, not hollow, alive, hungry. Jake made a choked noise. His lips barely moved when he whispered, Wendigo. I might have laughed if I wasn't so paralyzed with fear. But the thing in front of us, the thing watching us, it wasn't funny. And then it screamed. I can't even describe the sound properly. It wasn't just a cry. It was something raw and broken, like a person screaming and an animal wailing at the same time. It rattled my bones, vibrated in my skull, and before I even realized I was moving, we were running. Branches slapped my face. I didn't care. The snapping twigs behind us told me everything I needed to know. It was fast, way too fast for something that big. Jake was ahead of me, his breath ragged, his boots hammering the dirt. Don't look back, he gasped. But I did. I wish I hadn't. The thing was chasing us. It moved wrong, jerky, twitching, too many joints bending in the wrong directions. It wasn't running. It was lunging, covering impossible ground with each movement. Then Jake tripped. I skidded to a stop just as he hit the ground hard. I reached for him, but then I saw bony fingers wrap around his ankle. Long, skeletal, and human fingers. Jake screamed. He thrashed, kicking wildly, trying to rip free. But the thing held on. I acted without thinking. I grabbed a thick branch off the ground and swung. It connected. The thing reeled back, letting out another horrible, wailing shriek. Its skin split open where I'd hit it, like it was made of paper-thin leather. Black, tar-like blood oozed from the wound, hissing as it touched the earth. Jake scrambled to his feet. Go! We ran. Harder. Faster. I don't know how long we ran, but eventually the snapping twigs behind us stopped, and suddenly we burst out onto a dirt road. We didn't stop running until we were back at the car. We locked the doors, hands shaking, lungs burning. We sat there in silence, staring at each other, trying to process what had just happened. Then, finally, Jake rolled up his pant leg. His ankle was covered in long, deep scratches. But that wasn't the worst part. The cuts weren't bleeding. They were black, like whatever touched him was still inside. That night, I woke up to Jake screaming. He sat upright in his sleeping bag, panting, drenched in sweat. His eyes were wild. He wouldn't say what he saw, but he wouldn't go back to sleep either. A week later, I called him. He barely spoke, just kept saying he felt off, like something was watching him. Then he stopped answering my calls altogether. I went to his house. His front door was unlocked. Inside, it smelled wrong, like damp earth and something rotting. I found his phone in the living room. The screen was shattered, and outside, in the mud just beyond his porch, were hoof prints. They didn't lead away. They stopped right at his door. Story 4. I should have never gone to that damn cabin, but I did. It was late October, the air thick with the kind of cold that bites into your bones and stays there. My uncle's hunting cabin sat deep in the upper peninsula of Michigan, about a 20-minute drive from the nearest paved road. He used it during deer season, but he hadn't been up there in years. Arthritis, he said. I think it was something else. The place had no electricity, no plumbing, just an old wood-burning stove and a well outside for water. The air always smelled like damp wood and something else, something metallic. Blood, maybe, or rust. I told myself it was just my imagination. It wasn't. The first night was fine. I chopped wood, made a fire, cracked open a beer. The only sound was the wind howling through the trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The second night, the whispers started. I was outside, splitting logs, when I heard them, faint, curling through the air like cigarette smoke. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard my name, Ethan, soft, almost playful. I turned so fast I nearly lost my balance. The trees stood still, dark as ink. My breath came out in white puffs, the cold suddenly sharper. No one was there. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks. I'd been alone too long. The silence was getting to me. I went inside, bolted the door, and checked my uncle's old shotgun. Loaded, full chamber, just in case. An hour later, the scratching began. Slow, deliberate, right outside the window. I didn't move at first, just sat in my chair, heart slamming against my ribs. It was probably a raccoon, I told myself, or a bobcat. They came again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Long, careful drags, like nails on glass. I stood up, gripping the shotgun, and inched toward the window. My breath felt heavy, the kind of weight you feel in a dream right before something horrible happens. I reached the window. The candle on the table flickered, and then I looked outside and nearly screamed. A face stared back at me. Not a human face. It was pale, too pale, like dead skin stretched over bone. Its eyes were black voids, no whites, no pupils, just endless darkness. The mouth hung open, unhinged, as if the jaw had been broken. It grinned, and then it spoke, in my voice. Let me in. I stumbled back, knocking over the chair. My stomach turned to ice. That voice, it wasn't just mimicking me. It was me. The exact tone, the exact cadence. I grabbed the shotgun, heart hammering. The window shattered. Glass exploded inward, raining over the wooden floor. The cold rushed in, but it wasn't just the cold. It was something else, something worse. The thing reached inside. Its arm was impossibly long, stretching like taffy. The fingers were jagged, almost claw-like, the nails black and cracked. The smell hit me then, rotting meat, old blood, something sour and dead. I fired. The shotgun roared. The thing let out a sound, a high-pitched, shrieking wail that didn't belong in this world. It jerked backward, disappearing into the trees, moving too fast, almost gliding. Then silence. I stayed awake all night, shotgun in hand, staring at the broken window, waiting for the thing to come back. It never did. At dawn, I went outside. The ground was covered in frost, but something else caught my eye. Hoof prints. Huge, deep, like they belonged to something massive. But they ended right outside the window. No trail leading in, no trail leading out. I left that day. Told my uncle his cabin wasn't safe. He didn't say much, just nodded, eyes shadowed, like he already knew. Like he'd been waiting for me to figure it out on my own. A month later, he called me. His voice was shaking. Someone or something ripped the door off its hinges last night. I didn't know what to say, but I knew one thing for sure. It's still out there,